Welcome back to Calm Coding, everyone. Looks like you guys have been busy keeping up with cybersecurity news. Sent us a whole stack of articles this week. Always appreciate that. We're going to take a deep dive into some of the biggest stories. And let me tell you, this week has been something else.
Yeah, definitely not a calm week in cybersecurity. Botnets, AI scams, you name it. Buckle up, everyone.
Let's jump right in with a story that sounds like something out of a spy movie. This massive botnet called ngioweb that got taken down. Thousands of bots, almost 200 countries. I mean, the scale of this thing is just crazy.
It's wild, and the researchers over at Lumen, they spent over a year just analyzing this thing before they could even disrupt it.
Over a year. Wow. That shows you how complex these operations really are. The thing that I thought was super interesting was that this ngioweb, it was powering this whole shady proxy service.
NSOCKS.
Yeah, and so CKS. And basically, criminals could just rent access to these compromised bots.
Yeah.
Talk about hiding your tracks, right? And 2/3 of these proxies were right here in the U.S.
Yeah.
So, this stuff is closer to home than we might think. For our listeners who, maybe aren't super techie, can you break down what a proxy even is and like how it can be used for, bad stuff?
Sure. A proxy server, you can think of it like a middleman between your computer and, well, the internet. Sometimes they can be good for privacy, but in the wrong hands, yeah, they can definitely be used for cybercrime. Like attackers will use them to hide their location, so it's harder to track them down.
Makes sense. So this ngioweb thing, it sounds like it could have been used for some serious DDoS attacks.
No, absolutely. You know what a DDoS attack is?
Yeah, like when a website gets flooded with so much traffic that it just crashes.
Exactly. ngioweb, it had that power, and they were mainly going after SSO routers and IoT devices. It's a good reminder that even those everyday devices can be, turned into weapons.
Which is why it's so important to keep your devices updated. Speaking of scary stuff, let's talk about those fake AI tools that are being used to spread malware.
Oh yeah, that one's creepy. Hackers are using fake AI photo editors, video editors, even deepfakes of politicians, in their ads, all to trick people into downloading this malware.
Deepfakes. Man, those are getting so real, it's kind of freaky. And this campaign targeted both Windows and Mac OS users. No one is safe.
Nope, not this time. The malware, they disguised it as a program called Edit Pro, and it had all this nasty stuff packed in, like Lumen Stealer.
Lumen Stealer, isn't that
Yeah.
the one that steals your passwords and credit card info and all that?
Yep. Browsing history, crypto wallet details, everything. And it uses all these sneaky techniques to avoid detection, process injection, encrypted communication. They even had this thing called AMOS, which is like a command center for managing the malware.
So basically, anyone who downloaded this fake Edit Pro software just gave these hackers the keys to their whole digital life.
Pretty much.
Okay, so serious question. What should people do if they think they might have downloaded this Edit Pro thing?
First things first, get rid of the software. Like right now. Then change all your passwords, bank accounts, credit cards, everything. And enable two-factor authentication everywhere you can.
What about crypto?
If you've got any crypto or NFTs, move them to a new wallet with a brand new seed phrase. Don't take any chances.
Makes sense. Let's switch gears now and talk about DocuSign. Everyone uses DocuSign, right? But it looks like scammers have figured out how to use it against us.
We're seeing a huge spike in these DocuSign impersonation attacks, and they're specifically going after businesses with government contracts.
Yeah.
Like in the last couple of months, we've seen almost a 100% increase.
Wow, 100%. That's crazy. They're playing on that trust we have in DocuSign and also the trust we have in, government agencies.
Exactly. They'll pretend to be like the Department of Health and Human Services, the DOT, whoever. They send these official-looking emails with DocuSign branding, trying to get people to sign fake contracts or give up sensitive information.
It's a double whammy. You think it's DocuSign, you think it's the government, boom, you're hooked.
And it can really hurt businesses. Financial losses, disrupted operations.
Can you give us an example of how one of these scams works?
Sure. There was this construction company in North Carolina. They got hit with a fake compliance notice. The scammers, they pretended to be some government agency and demanded an $85,000 bond to stop this big hospital construction project from getting shut down.
$85,000.
Yeah.
Oof, that's rough. So what can businesses do to protect themselves from these DocuSign scams?
Be suspicious of anything unexpected, anything that demands immediate action. Check the sender's email address really carefully, make sure it matches the agency. And if you see any weird pricing, typos, or like technical terms that don't sound right, that's a huge red flag. And never, ever click on links or download attachments from suspicious emails. Always verify everything directly with the agency.
Good advice. Now let's talk about this data breach that hit Finastra. They're a big player in the financial world, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like this was some fancy hack. It was just stolen credentials.
Yeah, it's a reminder that sometimes the weakest link in security is us, humans. We make mistakes. We fall for phishing scams. We reuse passwords.
And in this case, those mistakes had huge consequences. Finastra works with over 8,000 institutions, banks, credit unions, the whole shebang. And this attacker, Abyss, they're selling a 400 GB archive of Finastra data.
400 gigabyte, that's a lot of data. The good news is it looks like the attacker didn't install any malware or mess with customer files. They were just after the data itself.
Still, that's a pretty big breach. And not all of Finastra's customers use the compromised platform, so maybe the impact won't be as bad as it could have been. But it makes you think, about the security of all those third-party platforms that we use.
Definitely. It's all connected.
Let's talk about this researcher who got framed for some malicious code on GitHub. This one is a real head-scratcher.
So there's this AI startup, Exolabs, and they found some weird code in their GitHub repository. And this code, it was trying to download something from a domain that was linked to this security researcher, Mike Bell.
Wait, so it's like someone was trying to make it look like this researcher was behind the attack.
That's what it seems like. Mike Bell says he had nothing to do with it, that he's being framed.
And the weird thing is, the attack itself wasn't even harmful. It was just designed to make him look bad. Some kind of smear campaign.
Maybe. It does show you how easy it is to impersonate someone on GitHub, though. Reputations can be ruined pretty easily online.
Speaking of reputations, let's talk about Microsoft and those accusations that they're trying to create a monopoly in government systems. This is a big one.
Back in 2021, Microsoft promised $150 million for cybersecurity services for the government. Part of that was giving them access to this Microsoft 365 Government G5 security suite.
Which is super expensive, right?
Oh, yeah. So some people are saying that this was Microsoft's way of locking in government agencies, make it too expensive for them to switch to a competitor.
So they get hooked on the whole Microsoft ecosystem.
Exactly. It could stifle competition. And, Microsoft's Azure cloud platform also benefits from this. They're competing with Amazon Web Services, so any advantage helps.
So it's a win-win for Microsoft, maybe not so much for everyone else. Is it unethical, though? Or just smart business?
That's the big question. Regulators in the U.S. and Europe are looking into it, so we'll see what happens.
Definitely keeping an eye on that one. Okay, let's lighten the mood a bit. Tell me about the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework, or OCSF.
OCSF is an open source project. They're trying to solve this problem of data normalization and interoperability in cybersecurity. Basically, a lot of security tools don't work well together because they all speak different languages.
Right, so it's a big mess of incompatible systems.
Exactly. So OCSF is trying to create a universal language for cybersecurity, a standardized framework so that all these different tools can actually talk to each other and share data.
It'll be huge. Who's behind this?
It started with AWS and Splunk back in 2022, but it's really grown, over 900 contributors now. And just recently, they joined forces with the Linux Foundation.
The Linux Foundation.
Yeah.
That's a big deal in the open source world.
It is. This means OCSF has access to a lot more resources, more visibility, and they've got a stronger governance model now. It could become the global standard for cybersecurity data sharing.
Fingers crossed. Now, for a story that shows just how vulnerable our data can be, a social platform for military personnel, US and UK, had a massive data breach.
Yeah, this one is a wake-up call. Force's Penpals, it's a dating and social networking site for military folks. They had a database exposed online, over 1 million records.
1 million. Wow. What kind of information was in there?
Names, addresses, social security numbers, service numbers, ranks, everything. Basically, an identity thief's dream.
And it was just sitting there, out in the open.
No encryption, no password protection, a really basic security mistake.
How did that even happen?
It sounds like the developers just forgot to turn off directory listing. It's like leaving your front door wide open.
It's scary how one little mistake can lead to such a massive breach. And it reminds us that even on platforms designed for specific communities, our data isn't always safe.
Exactly. They've secured the database now, but who knows how long it was exposed or who might have accessed it.
That's a lesson for all of us, Be careful what you share online, even on platforms you trust. And for organizations, especially those dealing with military data, strong security is absolutely critical.
Couldn't agree more.
Let's talk about Chinese hackers targeting telecom companies. Now,
Huh.
this is some real espionage stuff.
This is a big one. A Chinese state-sponsored group, they call themselves Salt Typhoon, sometimes Earth Estuaries or Ghost Emperor. They've been attacking major telecom companies, including T-Mobile. And get this, they were targeting the wiretap systems that the government uses for surveillance.
So they were after the systems that are supposed to keep us safe.
That's pretty bold.
Wiretap systems have a ton of sensitive information, call records, private communications, everything. And they were going after high-ranking U.S. officials. That's a serious national security threat. What about T-Mobile? How badly were they hit?
T-Mobile says customer data wasn't affected. But this was a widespread attack. AT&T, Verizon, Lumen Technologies, they were all targeted.
So it's a coordinated attack on the whole industry.
Looks like it. These telecom companies, they really need to work together, share information, improve their security.
It's like a digital arms race. Speaking of, there's this vulnerability in Fortinet's Windows VPN client that's been making the rounds.
This one is a strange one. The vulnerability was reported to Fortinet back in July, but there's still no patch, and it's being actively exploited.
Wait, so for months, everyone's known about this vulnerability, and it's still out there?
Yep. And it hasn't even been given a CVE number yet. It's like it doesn't even officially exist, even though it's a real threat.
So what are these attackers doing with it?
A Chinese group, Brazen Bamboo, they're using malware called Deep Data to steal login credentials and VPN server info from Fortinet VPN users.
So what are people supposed to do? Just wait for Fortinet to release a patch.
For now, yeah. Limit VPN access, keep an eye out for anything suspicious.
Let's move on to another ransomware group that's been making headlines. Helldown. It feels like there's a new ransomware gang popping up every week.
It does, doesn't it? Helldown is targeting Zyxel firewalls and IPsec access points.
Aren't those pretty common?
Oh, yeah. A lot of businesses use them. They're exploiting a vulnerability in Zyxel firewalls to get into a network. Then they use a known vulnerability in IPsec VPNs to inject commands and take control.
So they're using both a zero-day exploit and a known vulnerability. That's a dangerous combo.
It is. Then it's the usual ransomware routine. Data theft, encryption, ransom demand. They're using a modified version of the Lockbit 3 builder, so these guys are pros.
It's a good reminder that no one is safe from these attacks. What's the best defense against ransomware?
The basics. Keep everything patched, limit access, back up your data, and train your employees to spot phishing emails and those kinds of scams.
Speaking of important updates, Apple just pushed out a critical update for iOS.
If you're an iPhone user, you need to install iOS 18.111 ASAP.
That's serious, huh?
It fixes two critical vulnerabilities, CVE 2024-44308 and CVE 2024-44309, both of which are being actively exploited.
Okay, those names are a mouthful. What do they actually do?
The first one, CVE 2024-44308, it affects the JavaScript core framework. Attackers can use it to run malicious code on your device if you visit a compromised website.
Yikes. So just visiting the wrong website could get you hacked.
Basically. And the second one, CVE 2024-44309, it affects the WebKit engine, which powers Safari and other browsers on Apple devices.
So no matter which browser you use, you could be vulnerable.
Right. It can be used for cross-site scripting attacks where they can steal your passwords and stuff.
This sounds bad.
It is. And Apple says both of these vulnerabilities are being actively used by attackers.
So it's not just a theoretical threat.
Nope. Update now. If you haven't upgraded to iOS 18 yet, Apple also released iOS 17.7.2, which has the same patches.
So no excuses. Everyone, update your devices. Wow, we've covered a lot today. It's amazing how fast things are moving in cybersecurity.
It really is. Always something new to learn, new threats to worry about.
Well, we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more cybersecurity news in just a minute.
Welcome back to Calm Coding. We covered a lot in that first half of our cybersecurity news roundup, but there's always more, right?
I know. My head's already spinning. Botnets, breaches, vulnerabilities. And, looking at this stack of articles from our listeners, it's clear cybersecurity is a big focus for the second Trump administration.
It's a huge issue, and it's only getting bigger. Our whole lives are online now.
And they're tackling it from all angles. This article here outlines their top 5 cybersecurity priorities. Critical infrastructure, international cooperation, the works. Let's start with protecting U.S. critical infrastructure. What exactly does that mean?
Think of all the stuff that keeps the country running, Financial systems, power grids, water treatment plants, transportation, hospitals, communications, all vital.
So if any of those systems go down, it's a huge deal.
Well, yeah, millions of people could be affected. And the problem is that most of these systems, they rely on digital technology, which makes them vulnerable to attack.
And how common are these attacks?
One recent report said there were over 420 million attacks on critical infrastructure worldwide in 2024 alone.
420 million. That's like, what, 13 attacks every second? Crazy.
Yeah.
So what's the plan to protect all this stuff?
CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, they're the main players. But it's not just a government thing.
So the private sector has to be involved too.
Exactly. A lot of our critical infrastructure is actually owned and operated by private companies. So CISA works with them, provides training, does assessments. They try to make sure everyone's on the same page.
That's a massive job.
It is. And it's not just about stopping attacks. It's about making these systems resilient. So if there is an attack, they can bounce back quickly.
So a mix of proactive and reactive measures.
Right. Strong defenses, but also a good plan B.
Okay, so critical infrastructure is priority number 1. Priority number 2 is all about government cooperation and public-private partnerships. That seems pretty straightforward.
It does, but it's not always easy. You got to break down those walls between different agencies and the private sector. In the past, they didn't always talk to each other, which made it harder to deal with cybersecurity threats.
So it's like everyone was fighting their own little battles.
Pretty much. But the Trump administration wants everyone working together, sharing information, developing strategies, pooling resources.
Which makes sense, right? Cybersecurity is so complex, no one can handle it alone.
Exactly. We all got to work together to fight the bad guys.
Okay, so protecting critical infrastructure, better cooperation. What about the third priority, building upon government cyber risk management strategies? What's that all about?
Being proactive, identifying risks, figuring out vulnerabilities, and fixing them before someone exploits them.
So having a plan instead of just reacting to attacks after they happen.
Exactly. CISA is pushing these frameworks like zero trust, defense in depth, security by design. Have you heard of those?
I've heard of zero trust. The others, not so much.
Defense in depth is basically having multiple layers of security, like a castle with, multiple walls and moats. Even if one layer gets breached, the attackers still have to get through the others. Security by design means building security into products and systems from the very beginning.
So like baking security into the DNA of a system.
Exactly. Trying to fix security holes after the fact is like trying to fix a leaky boat while you're already out at sea.
Love that analogy.
Okay.
Okay, that's 3 priorities down. Number 4 is addressing the evolving technology landscape, which seems tough because technology is always changing, right?
Yeah, it's a moving target for sure. AI, machine learning, IoT, 5G, VR, AR, even quantum computing. It's a lot.
I can barely keep up.
Yeah.
How are these new technologies impacting cybersecurity?
They can be good or bad, AI and machine learning can be used to detect and respond to threats better. But then you have all these 5G and IoT devices, and that creates a massive network that's ripe for attack.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly. The trick is to stay ahead of the curve, understand the risks, and figure out how to manage them.
What about quantum computing? Everyone's talking about it. How's that going to affect cybersecurity?
Quantum computing, it uses quantum mechanics to do these incredibly fast calculations, way faster than regular computers.
So like a supercomputer on steroids.
Kinda, yeah. And while it has huge potential for science, it's also a big threat to cybersecurity.
How so?
A lot of our cybersecurity relies on encryption, like the stuff that protects your online banking.
Right.
While quantum computers could break that encryption.
So all our data could be vulnerable?
It's possible. But don't worry too much. Researchers are already working on new encryption that can resist quantum attacks.
It's a race then.
It is. As quantum computers get better, we need to make our encryption better too.
Makes sense. And finally, the 5th cybersecurity priority. Ensuring the cybersecurity of space systems. That's not something you hear every day.
It's a new frontier. We're relying more and more on space systems, satellites, ground stations, communications networks, so we need to make sure they're protected.
What are the challenges with protecting those systems?
Satellites, for example, you can't easily patch or update them once they're in orbit.
Yeah, and that's a problem.
And if someone attacks a space system, it could be really bad. We depend on those systems for communication, navigation, weather forecasting, even national defense.
So disrupting those systems could affect pretty much everything.
Exactly. And it's only going to get more important as we rely on space more.
So are we doing anything to protect these systems?
FIDA has this Space Systems Critical Infrastructure Working Group. It's a bunch of experts from government and the private sector. They're developing standards and guidelines for securing space systems.
Oh, it's a global effort.
It's starting to be. Everyone's realizing how important this is.
Okay, so we've talked about all 5 cybersecurity priorities. What's the takeaway?
Cybersecurity is a top priority for the Trump administration. They're doing a lot to protect critical infrastructure, promote collaboration, manage risks, all of that.
It's good to see they're taking it seriously. And it's a reminder that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. We all need to be careful and do our part to stay safe online.
I agree. It's not just about technology. It's about people, awareness, good practices.
Well said. Okay, that wraps up the Trump administration's cybersecurity priorities. We've still got a few more stories to get to, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Calm Coding. Thanks for sticking with us through this cybersecurity news marathon. It's been a lot to take in.
It has. I mean, we've gone from huge botnets to nation-state hackers and everything in between.
And it's not just the big stuff, right? Even those little mistakes, like that exposed database we talked about, they can have huge consequences.
Yeah, the Force's Penpals breach. It just shows you sensitive data can be vulnerable anywhere, even on platforms you think are, secure.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to, never let your guard down online.
Exactly. Always be vigilant, know the risks, take precautions, and stay informed.
Speaking of staying informed, let's talk about that emergency update that Apple just pushed out for iOS.
This one's a big deal. iOS 18.1.1. It patches 2 critical vulnerabilities, CVE 2024-44308 and CVE 2024-44309, and they're both being actively exploited, so it's serious.
It's not every day that Apple puts out an emergency update like this, so what are these vulnerabilities all about?
So CVE 2024-44308, it affects the JavaScript core framework. Basically, an attacker could run code on your device just by getting you to visit a website.
So like you could stumble across a booby-trapped website and get hacked without even knowing it.
Pretty much. And then CVE 2024-44309, that one affects the WebKit engine, which powers Safari and a bunch of other browsers on Apple devices.
So you could be using any browser and still be vulnerable.
That's right. It could lead to cross-site scripting attacks. They could steal your passwords, your accounts, everything.
And Apple's saying these vulnerabilities are already being used in the wild, so this is a real threat.
It is. If you're using an iPhone, an iPad, a Mac, anything, update right now. And if you haven't upgraded to iOS 18 yet, they also released iOS 17.7.2 with the same patches.
No excuses, people. Update your devices. Okay, let's finish up with one last story. It seems like there's a new ransomware group making headlines every week, and this week, it's Helldown.
Helldown's targeting Zyxel firewalls and IPsec access points.
Those are pretty popular, right?
Yeah, a lot of businesses use them. They found this vulnerability in Zyxel firewalls, a 0-day, and they're using it to get into networks. Then they exploit a known vulnerability in IPsec VPNs, CVE 2024-4257, to take control.
So they're using a combo of a 0-day and a known vulnerability? That's scary.
It is. Once they're in, they do the usual ransomware stuff, steal data, encrypt files, demand a ransom, and they're using a modified version of the Lockbit 3 builder so they know what they're doing.
These guys are the pros, so how do we protect ourselves from these ransomware attacks?
Keep your systems patched, limit access to trusted accounts, back up your data regularly, and don't forget about training your employees. They need to know how to spot phishing emails and those kinds of attacks.
So it's a multi-layered approach, just like we talked about earlier with the government's cybersecurity priorities.
Exactly.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into cybersecurity news. It's been a wild ride, but hopefully you've learned a few things along the way.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, but the most important thing is to stay informed, stay vigilant, and take the necessary precautions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. To all our Calm Coding listeners out there, stay safe online. And we'll see you next time.